Hi, everyone, and welcome back to the International Solidarity Pod, which is a podcast that aims to explore current affairs and history relating to imperialism, the global south, gender, political economy, and people to people ties. I'm your host, Ashwin. Be sure to subscribe to this channel and give this video a like. We count on your support. Today, we have on Breht O'Shea, who many will know as the host of Revolutionary Left Radio and co host of the Red Menace podcast. We cover a lot of ground in this episode. We talk about the state the left and the global north found itself in at the onset of the Gaza genocide and its, inability to effectively do something about it. We talked about broader global shifts taking place at the moment, how the rest of this century is shaping up to look like, the role of spirituality or humanism in our left politics, combating fear, cynicism, and individualism, the case for hope, and a whole bunch more. In addition to whichever platform you're watching or listening to this on, you can follow the work I do on Instagram at Journal of INTL Solidarity and on Substack at intlsolidarity.substack.com. If you're listening to this on either Spotify or Apple Podcasts, please leave a review as it helps get this program to new listeners. Without further ado, here's my conversation with Breht O'Shea. Okay, Breht. Again, thanks for coming on. Really appreciate it. So I wanted to start by asking you, we're almost 2 years now into the Gaza genocide. These 2 years in many ways have felt like the opening of a new political era globally, in which you see, the full collapse of international law and human dignity. Um, the beginning of this genocidal war in 2023 was quite jarring for me, I'd say. I found myself wondering, why we weren't able to mobilize effectively enough to, if not stop the genocide, then, cause serious disruptions in its ability to carry on. Um, it constantly felt like we weren't doing enough, and that's still the case today. My question to you is, what do you think the Gaza genocide revealed about the state of the anti-imperialist left in the global north or the imperial core? Have we learned anything since then, and how do we move forward?
Yeah, well, before I discuss perhaps what it means for the, anti-imperialist left, um, which I think in short is not only sort of an overall failure to organize adequately in the era leading up to this event, but also is in and of itself an educational event. Maybe we can circle back around to that. I think what you were talking about in the beginning of that question is important to discuss as well, which is this is not only is Palestine the front lines of anti-colonial and anti-imperial and thus anti-capitalist resistance, right? Because if we understand colonialism as the prerequisite primitive accumulation phase of capitalism, we understand imperialism as monopoly capitalism, as capitalism on the global stage, then we understand that Palestine is in this horrific life and death fight against all of those forces at once. So, you have to make that clear up front. But what I also think it's doing is it's unmasking this entire order. It's unmasking for people across the political spectrum, right? Like one of the worst things that could happen is an event for the coming from our perspective, like with our politics and thinking about the implications for the political systems that we live in, is that there's a clean dichotomy. Like, oh, the right supports this, the left doesn't. The left supports this, the right doesn't. That allows the system to stay in some sort of balance with a situation like Gaza, the genocide in Gaza, the Holocaust happening right now in Gaza, is an unmasking of the entire order and a full spectrum awakening to the truth underneath the rhetoric of this system, the truth underneath the rhetoric of the international rules-based order, as they like to pretend to tell us. And it's just also an unmasking of the pretensions of liberalism. This is actually what liberalism's always been, right? This is what capitalism has always been. Aside from the rhetoric of freedom and democracy and the respect for human rights and the respect for individual liberty and the sanctity of life, all that nonsense is just that, complete nonsense. Liberalism, capitalism were formed through these processes. And what we're seeing now in Palestine is like a real time on our smartphones hyper technological capacity to see what colonialism has always looked like, right? This is a techno settler colonial society, but this is what the U.S. was like during its manifest destiny phase, right? Its overt phase of stealing that land and massacring its people. So in that way, it's sort of horrific. It's heartbreaking. It feels out of time in a sense, like even the way that Israel talks about itself and tries to justify itself is just it tries to apply this liberal sheen, but really it is just this raw colonial logic at its core that anybody that has any good faith attempt to try to understand what this is can see immediately. So I do think it is this crucial aspect in this delegitimization of this entire system. And we've known that this system has been in crisis. When I say this system, I mean liberal capitalism, broadly speaking, which implies imperialism and colonialism, that this system has been in crisis for a while, for a long time. In fact, its whole history is a sort of series of rolling crises. But specifically, 2001 with 9/11 was like the rolling of the credits on the American Empire, even if we didn't know it then. And 2008 was the end of the film. Like, this whole American experiment is over and it's all downhill from here. And part of that process, and I think Lenin points this out, I can't remember the quote off the top of my head, but he says something about like the bourgeois order must be like completely exhausted before people turn to something new. Like all the old forms of bourgeois rule have to be seen through, have to be unmasked, and this whole process takes longer than you or I would want it to take. But it is a necessary process that is a part of this decay. The whole world can now see it for what it is. Now, coming back around to what it means for the anti-imperialist left, like I was saying, it's simultaneously a indictment of our failure, right? Frantz Fanon said that every generation must rise to the challenge, right, or disappear into opacity. Like every generation has to step up and meet its obligations historically, or fail to do so. And it seems clear that the imperial core left, of which I am a part, right, has failed to build the levels of organization needed to even begin to go on any meaningful defense, let alone offense, with regards to an issue like Gaza. It really kind of makes you yearn for the Soviet Union for, despite all of its flaws, it represented a real economic, military, and ideological bloc that, in a circumstance like this, would have been met with some resistance, right? It would have provided, who knows, arms shipments into Gaza. Maybe it would have used it as an attempt to send in proxy forces to fight back. Who knows exactly how that would have played out? But that is what happened during the Cold War. Well, the Cold War was a hot war. It just wasn't between the US and Russia or the Soviet Union straight on. It was dispersed throughout the global South in the form of proxy wars, which is not an ideal situation by any means, but still there was some resistance. And with the fall of the Soviet Union, not only do you see the rise of this neoliberal austerity politics in the West, which there's no international system of competition for the West anymore, so we can kind of ramp it up and do what we want. But also, you see on the imperialist front that there is very little organized resistance. Now, we would hope that that organized resistance would not only come internationally, but would be able to come from within the imperial core itself. And we have failed to build the structures and the systems and the levels of organization needed to do it. That's not to downplay the very serious protests and organizations that have risen, that the encampments, groups like Palestine Action, who take direct action against weapons manufacturers that are slaughtering Palestinians and participating in this genocide. There has been, worthwhile movements, but it's clearly not enough to actually stop the death machine, and so it's cold comfort to the Palestinians, unfortunately.
Yeah. Related to this, I mean, I wanted to ask you, I mean, you've been on the Marxist left, and doing political organizing work for quite a while now, certainly longer than I have. In that time, I'm sure you've learned a lot. There are things that will have contributed to shaping your worldview. You're also someone, who really emphasizes socialist politics as a politics of humanity, as a millennia-long process of advancing humanity. So at a personal level, I wanted to ask you, how do you think this genocide has impacted your worldview and your sense of reality. And I asked this, I mean, it is a like it's a personal question, maybe it's not it might not seem like it guides political struggle, but I asked this because, it might be clarifying for folks, in helping them process the reality of the world we find ourselves in now, and for us to better orient ourselves toward political struggle.
Like the question is, what is it like meant for me personally, and how has it
Yeah,
impacted
like
me?
I mean, I know for me, it's sort of shattered my worldview and my sense of reality. I mean, how's it impacted your worldview and your sense of reality?
It's, I mean, first and foremost, it's been devastating. It's broken my heart every single day. And I'm a father of three children, and you don't have to be a parent to, have your humanity and your heart broken. But as a parent, it's this surreal hyper reality wherein I am catering to my children, giving them food, making sure they're clothed, kissing them goodbye on their first day of school, while immediately I look back over or am just aware of parents just like me with kids my children's exact age who want to live just as much as we do, who have dreams of the future just as much as we do, who love each other just as much as we do, being starved to death, brutalized, and mass murdered in front of the whole world. In World War II, when the Nazis did their Holocaust, there was a real ability for most people around the world to say, we didn't know. Like kind of came out afterwards, and we put the pieces together. And when the Red Army marched in and liberated the camps, they were horrified at what they saw, got the word out. That excuse doesn't hold anymore. But this is the same thing. And so in a previous era, less people knew what was actually happening, but the world, in some sense, came together to stop the Nazi menace. There's other reasons. It's in Europe, so that matters more to European countries. There's a whole bunch of variables we can discuss, but what I want to emphasize is the same thing is happening. The Zionist entity is the Nazi Germany of our time. It is conducting a Holocaust. We have no excuse to say, with the communicative technologies of the 21st century, we have no excuse to say we can't see it. Those of us who do see it are just devastated by it. There's this horrific feeling of impotence in the face of it, that even though you know what's happening, you see exactly with pure clarity what this is. You still live in a society where the major forms of media and political power are in full support of this macabre, grotesque mass murder campaign, that you go to work every day, struggle to pay your bills, and you know that your taxes are not being spent on healthcare or education or solving poverty or preparing to address climate change or anything meaningful for society. It's being spent in large part on the $1 trillion a year Pentagon budget broadly, but in arms shipments to fucking Israel and money shipments to Israel, where these settlers have free healthcare and free education, and they bring out their families to block aid trucks to starving children. It is grotesque. Words don't suffice. So it's obliterated me, and I know it's obliterated other people who pay attention. And yeah, it's again like that feeling over and over again that just words don't suffice. That I fantasize, if I could be dictator of the world for a day, or if I could have godlike powers, just going in and stopping this. And no matter what happens after this, right? No matter if there is or isn't accountability, no matter if history is or isn't on our side, of course it will be. That's not going to stop the slaughter happening literally as you and I speak. And so that gap between knowing and seeing exactly what's happening and wanting so badly to stop it, and then the other side of that gap, which is your seemingly complete inability as an individual or even as an organization at this point to do anything meaningful in real time to stop it, while watching your disgusting society either justify it or go about buying things like it's not happening, right? Even people in my own life, friends and family, they just live their life like a fucking Holocaust isn't happening and like they aren't paying for it. And it's just this, again, this surreal, dystopian reality, and that's kind of the price you pay for having a functioning brain and for having, more than anything, a sensitive heart in this world, is that you pay that price of unfathomable heartbreak, when you're living in the, the belly of the beast in the U.S. imperial core, just in the U.S. dominated order that we all live in, that you have to see this stuff, be aware of the injustice, and feel impotent to stop it. But that is our responsibility. Going back to the Fanon quote, our responsibility is to build up the capacity to stop it, build up the capacity to do something about it. And what does that mean? It means building political power. And that's not easy. And the system that is has spent decades preventing the organization of organized, principled anti-imperialist left-wing movements in the imperial core and throughout the global south, right? In the imperial core through subterfuge and infiltration and suppression and ideological conditioning, and in the global south through violence and bloodshed. Right. So it knows that it has to keep a lid on it. So I'm not trying to, say it's 100% our fault, but that is our responsibility. And so there's that feeling of impotence, but don't let that sink you into despair because, as I always think, and as has been said many times, how dare you and I in the imperial core feel despair? How dare we even contemplate giving up? The Palestinians, the people in the global south, the people of Yemen, do they have a choice to give up? They're facing hardship and brutality that you and I can only dream about in our worst nightmares, right? They face it every single day and they don't have the choice to give up. So that also inspires us is like there's no excuse. Yes, we're heartbroken. Yes, we're devastated. Yes, we feel impotent, but we owe ourselves, the future of humanity, and our brothers and sisters across the global south, and specifically in Palestine, to continue to educate, to agitate, to organize as much as we can. And certainly, insofar as we're Americans in this grotesque electoral system, retract all support forever for any party or politician that has done anything but oppose this every step of the way. You can never again vote for a Democrat as the lesser of two evils after Joe Biden oversaw the first half of this genocide. As AOC, the pretender to be a representative of the socialist left in the US, votes for ammunition to restock the Iron Dome, right? The greatest analogy that came out of that is like, well, I didn't give the mass shooter the gun. I just gave him the bulletproof vest, so it's much harder for anybody to take him down. That is facilitating genocide. And so the least we can do is never forget who the fuck was a part of this. Never let them squirm out of this. Because in 5 years, 10 years, all the people that remain silent, that actually had like, political power, people like in politics, people in mainstream media outlets who had the reach and the influence and the power to do something meaningful, to move the dial on this thing. Every single one of them that refused to do that in 5 to 10 years will come out and say, just like the Iraq War, after it's all done, after all the people are dead, they'll come out and say, "Yeah, it was a mistake. I was actually kind of against it the whole time." And no, we have all the fucking communications. We have all your little memos you put out. We have all the tweets you put out every step of the goddamn way, and we will never ever ever let you live this down. But again, cold comfort, right? Doesn't feel like enough. Nothing ever feels sufficient.
I wanted to expand on this, question of despair, hopelessness, that, you were talking about. I mean, a lot of people, particularly in the global north, in the imperial core, in addition to, watching a live stream Holocaust and genocide, are, seeing the gradual worsening of their lives. And from here, really quite quickly, turn to despair, cynicism, or nihilism. I see this particularly among people of my generation. A lot of people tend to, have hope in the young generation, that kind of thing. I mean, there's that aspect of things, but there's also this other aspect of things, right? In terms of, despair and cynicism. And I say particularly people in the global north because, obviously, in addition to things around us, getting worse and worse in terms of affordability, crumbling infrastructure, greater sites of immiseration on our streets and abroad, of course, etc. I think there's also, a cultural priming, right, in the global north where the media apparatus is so strong that it sells back to us the idea that things just don't get better, there's no hope, and fundamentally that, we don't have agency. This is sold back to us not just when I say the media apparatus, not just through, the news, right, but entertainment talk shows, music, right? The music that we consume and listen to, Netflix. I mean, the whole Black Mirror phenomenon, and all, there's a whole spectrum of films and television that sells these ideas back to us, right? Um, and part of this, the whole thing is, it's easier to imagine the end of the world than the end of capitalism. But yeah, I think at the core of this despair and cynicism is the internalization by people that, we just don't have agency to change things, to build a better world. I think that's really what is at the core, the question of agency. And so, accordingly, the solution to, cynicism and despair is this toxic individualism, which is, also another important feature of Western society. The idea that, if we can't do anything to change the world, let's just do the best we can for ourselves, forget the greater good, don't go out of your way for other people or building something bigger than yourself, etc.
Hmm.
You touched on this, started to touch on this, but how do we combat this, much deeper sense of cynicism, despair, and individualism that's, linked to it?
Great question and insightful commentary as you asked the question. There's so much there. The first thing I remind people is look through all of human history, right? This is life. This, I mean, it's challenging, it is hard, like all periods, all epochs of human history. Yes, there have been recesses of relative stability or comfort, but most places, most of the time, have gone through incredible hardship. Didn't have the technological buffers that we have today to kind of mediate a lot of that. The human story is one of forced growth through challenge. What is happening globally for our species is that we are now going through a growth pain process. The pain is being inflicted on us because the way we are living is no longer sustainable, right? As a species. And so climate change, the attack on the biosphere, the complete dropping out and hollowing out of any sort of spiritual anchoring or existential meaning in the world, the commodification, the secularization of everything, the desacralization of everything, right? At the psychological and spiritual level, all the way to the material and social level, it's being hollowed out. And what we're living through is a crisis as in our species. And more than that, in previous eras of crisis, it was often localized or regionalized, right? What was happening in China in 600 AD was different than what was happening in Europe at that same time. And it could be an apocalypse over here and just another Wednesday morning over here, right? But now we are so globally intertwined, and not only with each other, and not only through communication, but our technology is so powerful that now we have everything we do has implications for the biosphere and for the climate system, right? So we're deeply feeling our integration with the entire Earth system, and our human civilization is embedded within this Earth system, and our political and economic systems are no longer balkanized around the world. It's really one, it's continuing to be one big system, right? If the American economy collapsed today, everybody around the world would feel it. If China collapsed today, everybody around the world would feel it, right? If the EU collapsed today, on and on and on. We are deeply, deeply integrated. So, what we are being asked as a species by nature, really, but by the process of dialectical movement, is that we have to radically change the way that we've organized human society and the way that we relate to one another and the natural world around us. If we fail to do that as a species, then I don't know if it's extinction. It could just be civilizational collapse. It could be bottleneck effects. It could be, climate change tipping points spinning out of control and, things setting us back hundreds, if not thousands of years. So that's the broad bird's eye view of what's happening at a species level. We need to grow up. We need to evolve. And that has material implications, i.e., we need to reorganize our political and economic systems. And I think that also has psychological, orientations. This hyper individualist, consumerist lifestyle and expectation where we express ourselves through what we buy, everything has a price tag, and our entire economies are propped up by cultivating and plumbing our desires for more and more and more comfort and status, and aesthetical, showing off to other people. That whole way of life is dying. And when that collapses, it also has pressure on our own psychologies and our own lives. And now young people coming up in this system, are seeing that, like, basically whether they can articulate this to themselves or not, is that there's no future. That, at least in the US for many generations, there has always been a sense of the future. Since the Industrial Revolution, progress has happened such that your life is not only going to be technologically very different than your parents' life, but it should be better. There should be a material development, step by step by step. And we work towards, that's the whole idea of liberal progress, right? That this system of liberal capitalism is one step ahead of the other. Every generation takes a step forward and things get better and better. That's completely gone. That's completely gone. And so young people coming up are now disillusioned. There's no future. They've tried to do things like on the left vote for Bernie only to see that be stopped, right? This hope against hope that, okay, this guy at least is talking about core issues. Let's kind of vote for him. The Democrats say, no way. No, that's too crazy. That hurts our donors too much. Shut up. Then, after you ceded that ground on the left, the right wing populists get a turn. So dumbass Trump gets to go up there and pretend he's the fighter for the little guy, that he's going to fight the elites, that he's going to bring real change, right? I always say that Trump is the right's Obama. Hope and change and more of the same. Promises of we're going to do this, and then all the people get excited. I was 19 when Obama ran his first presidency. I got politically activated under the Bush administration as a teenager with the Iraq War. And so, I was 19 years old. I was having my first child, my daughter, and I remember sitting in the room of the hospital room while my daughter was going to be born, watching Obama do his inaugural acceptance speech, right? And really feeling like, okay, after 8 years of Bush, like this is change. And Obama really was the last off ramp. Obama had super majorities in Congress. He could have changed things dramatically. He had, coming out of the war, mass disillusionment, disdain of all the systems. With the financial collapse, people hated the big banks. And Obama was the real last shot to shift this trajectory of this sinking ship in a direction that wouldn't hit the iceberg, right? But more of the same. And so Trump is now this tripling down on the same. More than this false idea that Trump is a break with neoliberalism, he is neoliberalism turned up to 100, right? Just with this populist rhetorical sheen. It's no mistake that he uses Ronald Reagan's slogan, "Make America Great Again." And we have a joke on the left that every graph you look at where things get shittier and shittier, it starts in like the 1980s, right? With Reagan, and then everything gets worse, inequality gets worse, homelessness rises, home pricing becomes, unaffordable for people. So under the banner of making America great again, this reactionary, nostalgic, backward turn, Reagan ushered in the era of neoliberalism. And now under the banner once again of make America great again, the new Reagan with a populist sheen comes along to just make everything worse. Whether you like Trump or not, you have to really be in the cult to think he's solving problems and making things better. You got to really be locked into this fever dream ass cult to think that what is happening is not everything getting worse and tripling down on all of the worst policies and trends that have been the case for the last 40 years. So so in that context, people say, "Hey, on the left, we tried, we can't get it through the Democratic, society. If you want change, vote for it. We voted for it, we were blocked." Then on the right, they said, "Okay, now it's our turn." Voted for it, and unless you're again totally indoctrinated in the MAGA cult, it's not working out. And there's many people on the right, from Nick Fuentes to Tucker Carlson to the podcast bros, that are realizing 6 months in that, oops, this is a complete catastrophe. This is not what we wanted. This is a betrayal of what he ran on, etc. And so then young people are like, okay, I can't even use the political system. You told me my whole life that at least if I wanted change, I could vote for it and I could have a candidate that would bring about change. Can't even do that. And so in that context, what happens? People become disillusioned and they live in a very hyper individual society, as you were saying, where it's just like, all right, I'm going to, I guess, try to get mine. And so there's people like, get the bag. I'm gonna break out. I'm just gonna do what I gotta do. I'm gonna invest in crypto. I'm gonna fucking go a 24/7 hustle grind set, right? I'm gonna get into finance. Like, there's that subsect of people who are just imbibing the ideology still in its rotting, decaying phase. But a lot of other people, like, there's no realistic chance that most working class kids are going to invest in crypto or become a finance. I live in Omaha, Nebraska. You're a young Gen Z working class, kid like I was in Omaha, Nebraska. You're not getting into high finance. You're not, going to manosphere your way into a six-figure income, you're just fucked. And so, in that context, what happens is despair, disillusionment, and what happens in an individualist society? People internalize that structural failure as personal failure. They see themselves as not having lived up to what they wanted to be. They see themselves as having failed to become whatever, a provider for a family or a successful person in any way. And that inward despair turns into self-loathing, self-hatred, recoiling from society, taking the black pill, if you will, or just muddling through your shitty job, and bitching about it online, and then, doing drugs so you can go to sleep at night. That's where this system was always leading. Where we are now is the logical outcome of where this system was realistically always leading. But against that despair is the reemergence of struggle, the reemergence of history, the reemergence of community through organization. That is still there. And what's going to happen in the US, unfortunately, we are not a proactive people. So it's not like tomorrow people are just going to get inspired by, you or my, stirring words and start organizing, come together. Some people will, and God bless them. That's our only hope. But what's more likely going to happen is this system is going to slam into the brick wall that it's always been heading toward. This system is flying off a cliff, and Trump and the techno oligarchs are hitting the gas pedal as we approach the edge. It's going to fall apart. And we've actually seen, and only in the wake of that falling apart is there actually going to be room for the sort of change that we want to see. This is not pessimism or optimism, right? This is realism. It's pessimistic and then it's optimistic. But it's that we're going to come into some form of collapse, before we have the widespread impetus for serious change, and before the cold grip on the system of the gerontocracy, of Zionists, of the deep state, of corporations, before that grip can be ripped off the system itself has to implode and fall apart. And if we go back in history, 100 or so years, we saw that happen with the Gilded Age, right? With the Roaring Twenties, and then with the Great Depression, and then into World War II. And that gave rise to the deeply imperfect, and we can talk about the racial dimensions of the New Deal and the ways in which it protected capitalism instead of really challenged it, but also the ways in which it had to happen because of the Soviet Union threat of socialism for working people across the world, and for the internal organizing of communist and socialist and IWW and radical movements leading up to it that pushed it in this social democratic. The only time in American history we've had anything like social democracy was the New Deal. And that's not sufficient, but it's better than anything we've had before or since. And that only came about, that radical change in American life after the era of the robber barons and the Gilded Age, only came about in the wake of the Great Depression and World War II. And so, unfortunately, I feel like that is going to have to happen. And until that happens, and it's going to happen, right? The system is unsustainable. It's going to happen in one way or another. Climate pressures, economic collapse, World War III, some combination thereof. It's going to happen. And, in the meantime, as a whole culture, we're going to kind of just drag our feet and droop our heads and go through this malaise until the whole fucking thing explodes. Now, for those of us on the actual organized left, the importance of education and organization is because in the inevitable ruins of that, we got to build something out of it. And we have to have the collective organizational, educational, ideological coherence and levels to be able to be a real political force in the wake of that collapse or catastrophe, right? And in lieu of that, if we refuse to live up to that responsibility, then that vacuum after the collapse will just be filled by institutional fascism, some form of barbarism, right? Some sort of climate authoritarianism, trying to hold on to what the U.S. has in a world decaying around the edges of, around the periphery as climate change really sinks its fangs into the human species and makes us hurt. So yeah, the organization is non-negotiable. We have to continue, continue, continue. But truly, I don't think revolutionary change is possible in this society until the inevitable collapse, which is no longer than 10 to 20 years out. Like, the economic system alone, even if there is no outward pressure on it, the economic system as it currently stands and has stood my entire life alone will fall apart in 10 to 20 years without anybody coming in and forcing it to fall apart. It's just unsustainable in its own right. But then you add on top of that global international crises, economic collapse, climate catastrophes, mass migration in the face of climate catastrophes. You put real pressure on that already rotting, decaying corpse of a system. It's set to explode. So that's our responsibility. And in the meantime, we have to build community. We have to create psychological and emotional resilience. We have to understand that we are part of a bigger human story, and our ancestors, no matter who you are, your ancestors fought and overcame enormous challenges that you're lucky enough never have to even think about. And this is our historical moment, and we have to rise up and do our best to steer it in the proper direction. And ultimately, as I always say, we are not the passive playthings of history. We are the vehicles through which history manifests. Our actions, our choices, is what posterity looks back on and calls history. So this feeling of just being like a passive, determined, plaything of forces that can never be intervened upon, that is an illusion. We are history, and so that gives me some sense of determination as well, right? Like what we choose to do dictates how can influence, at least if not dictate, how things turn out, and then people in the future look back and call that historical forces, but that was just human beings acting consciously on their world in the final instance. So yes.
Very related to this, I mean, you're talking about the importance of, political organization, building political organization. And then when we come back to the question of, the values or the emotions of, despair and hopelessness and things like that, it makes me want to get, your thoughts a little bit further on, you're a spiritual person. I would also, I think maybe there was a point in my life where I was more spiritual. I'm, coming back into that. Um, what role should spirituality or like, an explicit kind of humanism play in left politics? I mean, at least in the spaces that I've been, and again, like, in the imperial core, we're relatively weak. Um, in terms of organization, and at least in the spaces that I've been in, I would say there's sort of this, this dimension that's sort of lacking. I mean, revolutions in the past have really won through will, resilience, and spirit. I mean, and you can even talk about, this kind of thing playing a much bigger role in the global South. But even if you zoom in on Palestine, I mean, faith plays a big role in the continued resistance, put up by Palestinians, and not just the political resistance, in Palestine and in the region, of course, but also, the civilian kind of resistance. And of course, I mean, what's happening is atrocious. It shouldn't be happening in the first place. But to the extent that you know. Folks in Gaza and Palestine more broadly are withstanding this, are pushing through this, living to see another day. Um, a lot of this is, a lot of what's behind this is faith in the Islamic faith, right? There is a spirituality. I mean, I think of the journalists on the ground in Gaza, and seeing their resilience, their steadfastness. I don't think it can be disconnected from this spiritual dimension of things. And then for us in the global north on the left, I mean, a lot of our global north left and especially sort of Marxist communist traditions come from a sort of both a reaction against reactionary, religion in the form of organized, Christianity, Catholicism, etc. I mean, I'm in Canada, right? I mean, in Quebec, you had the whole Quiet Revolution that, quote unquote, brought Quebec into modernity because it was resisting against the Catholic Church. The history of communism, is largely associated with an atheist kind of history. It's reacting to this history of religion, and so as inheritors of that tradition, we and as inheritors of that tradition, we sort of internalize that aversion to religion or spirituality, and those two get lumped together. Um, and of course, the lack of religion and faith and spirituality is good for capitalism, it's good for consumerism, of course.
Mhm.
And I fear that sometimes we internalize that. We internalize that even in our politically organized space. So after that long prelude,
Mhm.
what role should spirituality or an explicit kind of humanism play in left politics today?
Yeah, well, I'm notoriously long-winded, so never apologize for a good question. So many things to touch on. So let's just go down a couple of things that you said. One, why is Marxism atheistic in its sort of foundational structure? Marxism came out of the Enlightenment movement, broadly conceived. It saw the Enlightenment as we see liberalism as pretending to be something it wasn't, as this half formed revolution where some of the ideas were good, but how liberalism functioned in practice was anathema to its actual professed ideals. And so there's a sense in which Marxism is trying to actually fulfill the loftiest goals of the Enlightenment. And we trace certain strains of the Enlightenment back to Spinoza, inseparability, deep connection between all things, dialectics, etc. So all that is to say is that it came out of a movement, the Enlightenment broadly, but also political movements that were reacting, as you said, responding against a social order that was heavily drenched in institutional religion, and that institutional religion was inseparable from political forms of domination that they were fighting against. In feudal monarchical Europe, institutional religion and the power structures of the monarchy was a singular thing. There really was no separating those two things out. And as feudalism came to an end, you have the rise of industrial capitalism. There was still that superstructural lag. And even today, we see in the U.S., evangelical church in the United States, how religion can so often form and become attached to the dominant power structure. That's always going to be a threat of religion, and we see it in many different instances, right? Hinduism in Modi's India, Christian nationalism in the U.S. Jewishness in the context of Zionism in Israel is this sort of bastardization of a beautiful millennia-long culture, ethnicity, religion that is Judaism, and then the usurping of that for a settler colonial apartheid genocidal project, which actually, to tie yourself to that is actually anti-Semitic. You're reducing this beautiful tradition to this grotesque state project in the same way that American evangelical right-wing Christians reduce the message of Christ to this horrific nationalist capitalist ideology that is just perfectly paired with the already existing status quo of the American ruling class. It's grotesque. That's always the threat of religion, and that's what Marxists saw incredibly clearly and were arguing against. But we're also dialecticians. So we don't just copy and paste what Lenin and Marx said because they lived in a different time. We now live in a post-religious, completely commodified, desacralized world where everything is just a price tag. Nothing has any meaning beyond itself. There is no meaningful relationship with the infinite or with the majesty and mystery of the cosmos. At the same time, many of us do find it hard to go back and embrace the beliefs of our great grandparents, right? Even if I wanted to become a Christian again because I see certain benefits, I can't make myself believe, in the actual specific Christian dogma. So there is this thirst for a spiritual connection for some deeper meaning in the spiritual desert of consumer capitalism. But there's also this, as there always is, this prevention from going back into history and getting something out of it. Just as reactionaries nostalgically want to go back to a romanticized golden era in the past, the attempt to go back and trads in the modern American context try to do this, which is I'm going to go back and try to revive an older religion thing. And it doesn't really, it feels inauthentic, probably inwardly to themselves, but certainly outwardly looking in. So society has moved on, material conditions have changed. We now live in a post-religious world. The death of God, as Nietzsche would talk about, right? And in the wake of any higher anchoring or meaning in the West, there is all these forms of nihilism that emerge. And I think consumer capitalism is a form of nihilism. Hyper-individualism is a form of nihilism. There's all these social neuroticisms that emerge in the wake of that. So now our task is not to go back and try to reclaim an older religion. I think the dialectic is always pushing us forward. The only way out is through. And so what we need to do, just as communism is returning to community at a higher level, what we need to do is return to the sacred at a higher level. And we can get into what that means. I don't think it is conceptual or belief oriented, right? It's not a matter of like, I need to believe these claims about Jesus or Muhammad or the Torah. It's not about believing and conceptualization. It's about experience and transformation. So is there a way to engage with the sacred, with the utter mystery that is life, which everybody should have some relationship to? The fact that we're here at all talking on this spinning rock in this beautiful, mysterious cosmos, having no idea where this came from with our consciousness. Like, there's a deep mystery and profundity at the core of moment to moment experience that is often just overlooked. So there's something real there. We know that life is more meaningful than just buying and selling things, just extracting and plundering and buying, and then oh, I get a new CD and I get it. Oh, CD, Jesus, I'm a '90s kid. I get a new iPhone, I get a car, I'm gonna get a new house, get more things, get more things. Even if you got a million, billion, cajillion dollars and could buy everything you wanted, there would still be a howling void at the center of your soul wanting something more because consumption is not the way to happiness. So humanity is coming around to kind of realize that in fits and starts. So we understand why Marxism was atheistic in the past. We understand the material conditions have changed. We understand that to move forward not only requires outward social revolution, it requires inward psychological and spiritual development. We need to grow up. And my big argument, I'm writing a book about this, and I've made this argument in many places, is that ego identification, identification with the sense that we are, who am I really? Well, I'm not my body, I'm not my legs, I'm not my hands, I have legs, I have a body. What am I really? I'm something up here, right? I'm like, if you ask me where I really am, I would say I'm like behind my eyes, between my ears, kind of like the homunculi looking out at a world that is not me, right? I'm in this bag of skin, looking out at a world that is fundamentally not me and that is actually hostile to me. And that's that sense of separation, that sense of I'm in here, everything else that is not me is out there. That ego identification, which comes with talking to ourselves in our heads all day, that is a fundamental illusion that ancient religious traditions have actually been able to see through. And that at this time in human history, not only are we being asked to move beyond class society, what Albert Einstein called the predatory phase of human development, class society writ large, capitalism in particular, we're being asked to see through the illusion of our separateness. That you are not actually inside this bag of skin looking out at a world that is not you. You are the world, right? You and I are the earth become conscious. We didn't get put on the earth from some outside force. We bubbled up out of it. And insofar as the earth bubbled up out of the cosmos, we bubbled up out of the cosmos. We are the subjectivity of the earth. We are the intelligence of the earth and thus of the cosmos. And there is no separation. There's no separation ultimately, even though it feels this way, there's no separation between me and the grieving mother in Palestine. And when your heart breaks wide open and you weep for a total stranger, that truth is coming through. That's not actually something different. You can't just say that's over there somewhere. You feel in your bones that the injustice they're facing and the pain that they're experiencing is also, to a lesser extent, but still really your pain too. And we also understand just at a quantum mechanical level that there are no separate individual things, right? This is a metaphysical idea that things are static and individualized. If you get down and you zoom out to the level of quarks and protons and atoms, the whole cosmos is a soup of energy. And like eddies in a whirlpool, it takes a form here, it takes a form here, star over here, black hole over here, human being over here, frog on a log over here, right? But that these manifestations are temporary expressions of a deeper, fascinatingly and inexorably connected soup of energy, for lack of a better word, that connects us all. And you can see this intellectually through science and philosophy and dialectics, but you can feel it viscerally through spiritual practices that have been in the Sufi Muslim tradition, that have been in the Kabbalah Jewish tradition, that have been in the Christian mystic tradition, that have been in the ancient, Vedic texts of the Hindu tradition, and that was really like sort of the practice was synthesized into a particularly potent form, in my opinion, through Buddhism, which is like really let's like get to the practice itself that unveils this reality inwardly. And so I think that we can contribute to the evolution of humanity through outward political work of revolution and inward political work of expanding our consciousness beyond mere ego identification to see the inseparability of us and others and us in the natural world. And that maturing process creates wisdom and compassion and responsibility that humans don't have. I believe human beings are in their adolescent phase. They are in their adolescent phase. They want things. They're sort of reckless. They have these like really now like kind of adult powers, but they still have this childish mindset. I'm talking about our species as a whole. And so that is why we can build supercomputers, we can build AI, we can build the James Webb Space Telescope, we can build, the Large Hadron Particle Collider, and at the same time, we can have ethno-supremacist Israel trying to starve children so it can take their land, and we can have Donald fucking Trump leading the most powerful country on earth, and we can have a society where we're just like scrolling on our dumbass fucking phones, looking at stupid shit we can't even remember 5 minutes later. It's like this is a gap that needs this is a contradiction that needs to be resolved. So I do see spirituality as a psychological and existential component of this broader movement forward that we can actually contribute to through our own actions. And then the last thing I would like to say is you mentioned the faith of the Palestinians. While I'm not particularly capable perhaps of believing in the dominant cultural religion of my time, Christianity, in the way that my great great grandparents did, I still see that it gave them certain capacities, certain depths, certain connections, certain comforts. And in the Palestinian context, there is no doubt that their faith is a core aspect of their strength, and that's just true. And if the same thing happened to secularized, desacralized, hyper-individualist Americans in the imperial core, used to comfort and meaninglessness and narcissism, it would, and not that it hasn't destroyed Palestinians in so many ways, it's a brutal fucking thing. It would destroy any human thing. But we would be much less capable of facing that level of hardship and tragedy because we believe in nothing bigger than ourselves. No matter what a lot of people in the West say, when push comes to shove, they really don't believe in anything more than themselves. And they'll say, well, I do care about my family and stuff. That's just a narcissistic extension of you, right? And so there's nothing, you're not living for anything bigger. You're living so you can get money, so you can get comfort, so you can get the people around you money and comfort, and that you have this vision of in old age, I'll retire and whatever nice rosy image of the future you have that will actually never come to pass. You're not living for anything bigger than yourself. So when we see a people that still live for something bigger than themselves and have unshakable faith in something bigger than themselves, and that their life is imbued with meaning outside of their individual self, we see an enormous amount of strength and resilience that a lot of us over here, we might fool ourselves into thinking we can have, but we really can't fathom. And so I think it does boil down to something bigger than themselves. And our task now is in the hollowed out desert of the death of God in Nietzschean terms here in the West, we have to forge a way forward that takes seriously that spiritual and existential component, and that is not anti-science, right? It's actually, instead of being pitted against the scientific worldview, it's an extension of it. Science is also just constantly bumping up against the mystery. I mean, go into cosmology or theoretical physics or quantum mechanics, and there's fascinating theories, but nobody knows what the fuck is going on. It's amazing that our little monkey brains can figure out how much we have figured out, but really, there's still, at the end of every scientific line of inquiry, a huge, gorgeous, shining question mark. And that doesn't mean that this religious faith or that religious faith is true. Again, I'm getting away from beliefs. And and I'm interested in a religious orientation or a spiritual practice that is experiential, not belief centered, and that actually transforms and uplifts the human consciousness, not one that re-entrenches its already existing ego and biases, which a lot of, evangelical Christians today, just like, God talked to me and said, I got to vote for Trump. That's not God. That's your ego. You're talking to yourself in your head and you're mistaking that for God. And you're using God to justify your already existing egoic structure, as well as your already existing social, political, and economic biases and prejudices. That's not transformative. That's using God as an extension of the ego. God is love and interconnection, and it, like Kali, destroys the ego. It brings death upon the ego. Kali with all the human heads, the goddess of time and death, holding all the human heads. that is enlightenment holding all of your personality components, right? Your egoic structures just dangling there, dripping with blood. They're done. That is true transformation. So, yeah, again, this could be 7 hours of discussion, but that's kind of my approach to these things. Some people don't agree with me. It's totally fine, but that's kind of the space I'm carving out and the message I'm pushing.
And I think it's an important one as well at that. Um, I wanted to now shift gears a little and talk about the second Trump administration. Just a brief question here. I wanted to ask you, um, to what extent do you see this Trump regime as marking a paradigm shift both on the global stage, similar to to the shift toward neoliberalism that happened in the 1970s to 1990s, but also domestically? What does this mean about the strength of the political right in the U.S. going forward? So, those two dimensions, domestically with the political right and globally, a larger sort of political economic shift.
Yeah, so globally, this is the context of American decline. That American hegemony, that was alive and well region or hemispherically with the Cold War, but after the collapse of the Soviet Union was the unipolar hegemonic moment for the U.S. And out of that moment, we got phrases like the end of history from Francis Fukuyama, this right Hegelian insistence that liberal democracies and capitalism, yeah, there's still some flaws. We got some kinks to work out, but more or less we figured out the optimal socio-political economic system, and we just need to like sort of advance it, tweak it, refine it, and we're good to go. That was the hubris of an ephemeral moment in history. That was the hubris of post-Soviet collapse, U.S. hegemonic, um, you know, triumphalism. And 9/11 was a stab in the heart of that whole picture. And then we talked about the economic collapse, and we've been in a zombie economy ever since. I also want to touch this moment where the end of history comes out. And I just posted this on Instagram the other day. The first lines of my favorite TV show of all time in 1999, The Sopranos. Tony is talking with his therapist over B scenes of like, suburbia. And he's saying, you ever feel like that you came in at the end of something, that the best is behind you? And his therapist says, I think a lot of Americans think that. Well, Tony was talking about the mob, right? The mob in the late 90s. It's the RICO's happened. It's been decimated. It's not what it was in the 70s and 80s. And he feels like as like a mob boss, he's coming in at the end of a mob era. But it was this prophetic moment about the end of American empire that it what hadn't happened yet, but that there was a cultural feeling that was moving in that direction. And I always think about what were the cultural products of the late 90s, early 2000s. It was rage, pessimism, this masculinist despair. Think Fight Club, WWE wrestling, South Park, Limp Bizkit, Eminem, right? I'm a 90s kid, so I was into this shit. I was born in 1989. Jackass. It was this adolescent, petulant, aimless, directionless rage at the peak of empire. The roller coaster was at the very top. And, for a lot of white suburban fucking kids in the 90s America, life was idyllic. Gen Z and Gen Alpha, they now nostalgically look back on the 90s as like, damn, I wish I had my childhood back then. And not for no reason. But there was this cultural milieu of like, fuck you, and just like stupid, dumb, adolescent frat bro punching a hole in drywall feeling to the moment. And a cultural product like The Sopranos kind of got at something prophetic. And after 9/11, you get the war on terror, and that's the decline of empire. And then with 2008, that's the decline of American capitalism as such. And we've been living in the wake of those events ever since then. And in fact, the Holocaust in Palestine cannot be separated from the war on terror. All of the ideological accoutrement of the war on terror is now shoved in our face. They're savages. They hate gay people. They'll throw you off a building if you're queer. Israel is the only democracy in the Middle East, the most moral army, blah, 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 blah. So it's fascinating how that comes back, first as tragedy, then as tragic farce. But here we are. So I just wanted to make a little interesting cultural critique of the late 90s, early 2000s as this moment of change. But ultimately, the American empire is in decline. Its hegemony is waning, but it's not dead yet. and it's lashing out, and it will continue to lash out as it further and further declines. And in the face of decline, there are always these revanchist movements and these nostalgic movements, of which Trump is the perfect paradigm of make America great again, where there's this attempt to revive this dying corpse internationally, globally. We're going to make America great again. We're going to be the biggest military and economy in the world. We're going to basically, without saying it, and I don't even know if Trump knows this word, we're going to regain hegemony, right? And I'm going to do it through the pure force of my insane egoic will. And then people just need a strong man, daddy figure in uncertain times, and they line up and say, "Do it, please. Come save us, protect us." And so that's the global context. Now, multipolarity has already arisen, and it's only going to get furtherly entrenched. I think the U.S. and China could live in a theoretical world where they like are cooperative and see that their interests are not separate and they should work together to build a better world for both of their economies. And but actually, what's going to happen in this real world is there's going to be eventually a move to take Taiwan. And the U.S. is going to belligerently try to reassert its hegemonic power in the East and confront China over Taiwan. And that's, I think, perhaps, if not World War III, it's a great power war that we haven't seen in quite some time. And that something like Russia and Ukraine really pales in the face of what could happen in that context. So I think that's where we're headed. And then domestically, what's fascinating, and I call the Trump administration and the techno oligarchs backing him death drive accelerationists. For the techno oligarchs, all of which were at his inauguration, all of them, just fucking jerking him off constantly in the lead up to his victory because they know that if AI is what the Silicon Valley fever dream techno freaks think it's going to be, it's going to drastically change the world. And if you own these AIs, you will be vaulted into trillionaire status. And so they're getting on board the Trump train because they think Trump is going to give them the best shot over the next 4 years, which their timeline is like 2027, 2028. They really think this whole thing is going to come together and radically reorient the world. And Trump's deregulatory, pro-corporate, and also like subservient administration where you come kiss the ring and I'll give you what you want. They come and kiss the ring. And they're hoping that they can get this stuff online and they can become these techno corporate overlords of the future moving forward over this next four-year span if they can get in Trump's good graces. And Trump is genuinely, he's not breaking from neoliberalism. In words, he is. He talks, I mean, he does tariffs, and that's, anathema to neoliberals. And he talks about protectionism, but he's not doing industrial policy that would make tariffs function. He's not doing any sort of redistribution that would uplift the working class. He's not bringing back manufacturing. And even if you bring back manufacturing, it's not manufacturing as such that people are nostalgic for. It's the unions that made manufacturing good jobs 50 years ago. But again, the global economy has really changed. Are Americans going to go in mass into warehouses and factories again? And then fight for a union? I don't know. We'll see. I'm not so sure that's going to happen. And again, the manufacturing base itself is not necessarily going to be back. So what Trump is actually doing is, which is all right-wing populism, this pretension to change, this pretension to solve the problems, right? I'm going to fight the elites. I'm going to arrest the criminals. I'm going to make America great again. I'm going to bring up the working class, blah, blah, blah. That's right populist speech. In practice, just like all fascist and reactionary movements, it's a re-entrenchment of capital. And so what's actually happening is what I call death drive accelerationism. Death drive because by accelerating, you're going faster off the cliff. And accelerationism as like, we have to get this in. We have to just fucking take the fetters off this AI shit, take China, compete with them with no guardrails. Israel is doing the same thing. The American population, 50 and younger, are turning against us. In future iterations of political power in the U.S., regardless of what that looks like, they're not going to let us do what we're doing. They're going to become more and more of opposition to us. Trump is probably our last best hope, especially after this genocide. The whole world has woken up to what we really are. Trump is our last best hope to finish this project, to finish the Nakba. And so that's what I think they're going to try to do. And they still have 3.5 years to do it. So they're kind of slow rolling. There's this contradiction within Israel between the far right Likud party wanting to do the Greater Israel Project, do the ethnic cleansing right away. And the military itself, which is like, hey, we're under-resourced, our reservists are exhausted. Like, you can't push us into this next phase. We need time to kind of re-entrench and re-encamp and bolster our resources. And so, Netanyahu is kind of threatening, we're going in, but then he's like, oh, maybe we're not, because he's trying to navigate these tensions and he knows his entire career and life is really hanging in the balance of what happens with that contradiction. So, all that is to say that American decline lashes out with less and less power, and by doing so, exposes itself to the international community for what it really is, never a responsible leader, weaponizing its currency in the form of sanctions, and people are now forming BRICS, and that's a part of the multipolar process. And then domestically, this faux populist pretension to change, and behind the scenes, it is just this re-entrenchment of corporate domination, now buffeted by new technologies, specifically in the form of AI. So that's what we're living through. And if you go through a lot of these political rounds, you see the game for what it is. But I always think every 4 years, somebody turns 18, somebody comes into political consciousness at age 21, they fall for it all over again. And in 4 years, what's going to happen? The Democrats are going to run three APAC approved corporations in a trench coat. And the American population, so beaten down and beleaguered by 4 years of Trump insanity, will vote for a pile of shit over Trump, just like they did last time with COVID and 2020 protests. They voted for a decaying corpse in the form of Biden. They'll just vote for anybody that the Democrats vomit up. And then we'll have 4 more years of feckless, corrupt, neoliberal, oscillating, spineless, no attempt to solve the real problems, satiate the donor class nonsense. And then we'll get another psycho fascist who's going to scapegoat whoever the scapegoat of the day is. And we're in this cycle until collapse. Or unless we can make a real intervention in political power, I don't think that we have the organizational capacity in the next 5 years to do so. So I think that we're in this oscillating loop where people are just turning to the other party, hoping something will change until we hit that brick wall. And so that's the death drive accelerationism, domestically and globally. And I think I'll wrap up on this, the two closest times in history that we have to this current moment is the late 1800s through the early 1900s, end of the British Empire. It was an empire overextended, funneling its resources out to the fringes of its empire while its core decayed, and eventually that resulted in the shift of being a global power over to the US. And I also equate this time to the Roaring Twenties. I call it now the Groaning Twenties. The 2020s are the Groaning Twenties. It's not really roaring. It's roaring for the top 5 to 10%. For the rest of us, it's just this creaky, achy, fucking slog through shit. And that period of time right before the Great Depression and World War III is kind of what we're living through again. So those are the two: end of the British Empire, overextension and internal decay, and the robber baron Gilded Age leading up to the Great Depression and World War II. Those are the two closest historical analogs to what we're going through right now. And if you really want to become more sophisticated in your analysis of the present, going back and studying those two periods of history certainly can't hurt.
I knew I timed my next question well with how you would have responded to the previous one, but basically, no, now I want to get your reaction to, an episode we just did with Torkel Lausen, who, I know you've had on your podcast. We were discussing his latest book, The Long Transition Towards Socialism and the End of Capitalism. You've also done an episode on that. I'll play this approximately 3-minute clip, and I want to get your thoughts and reflections. So here, Torkel Lausen is, discussing how he sees the politics of the global north moving forward.
What will happen in the global north, I think that in the first instance we will see that they will go back to some kind of in a defense mode. Both as in state, but also as the working class. They are trying to defend the centuries of imperial mode of living. It's classes which are now see their privileged positions in the world system threatened, and they hope that the NATO powers can defend their freedom and their imperial mode of living in my part of the world, the Scandinavian countries. I think 90% of the population are supporting NATO, and they are seeing Russia and China as aggressive powers which are trying to take their privileged positions in the world system. But I think that in the coming decades, we will see a huge economic crisis. We will see a huge political crisis because the ruling class is bewildered and cannot find what to do. And we will see the ecological and climate crisis develop. And in this long crisis, there will be some kind of learning process which can change the attitude. But what will happen in America, I cannot predict. It can be a collapse and a meltdown in a more or less peaceful way as the Soviet Union melted down. But I can certainly also see the development of civil war scenario, taking into account the settler mentality and the amount of weapons in the US. But I think it is the duty of Marxists in the US and in Marxists in all countries to be able to say in a 5-year perspective, what will the political and economic development be? What is the event or which can start out which can trigger a revolutionary situation? What should the paroles be? Like the Russian Revolution, it was bread and peace. Huh? What is the crucial issue? What should our strategy be? What kind of struggle will be waged? What kind of struggle will be waged, and what kind of organizations will be need for this kind of struggle? And this is very important issues for any Marxist to try to answer these questions in each and every part of the world.
So, Brett, is the US going to collapse more or less peacefully like the USSR?
Yeah, so I love Torkel, and I agree with him. Like a lot of what he said overlaps quite well with my thinking on the subject. This imperial mode of living is an important aspect of this, right? And that cuts to the heart of the unsustainability and the injustice of the system. And one of the things that I'm trying to do as a Marxist in America, talking to regular Americans who might not have as much political education, is to constantly tie your desire, regular American, for like a decent, stable life with the war machine that is robbing you and robbing you and robbing people across the planet. That you can't have what you want as long as the Pentagon needs $1 trillion a year in endless wars, and the weapons manufacturers need, endless wars to keep going. But also, and this is a harder pill for them to swallow, the imperial mode of living is this hyper commodified, delivered to your door in 24 hours ass life that we're living. This DoorDash, Uber, Amazon delivery sort of consumption-based economy. Everybody has to go into debt so they can keep consumption up. Way of life, that has to go too. Okay, well now Americans like, hold on, I can't drive my SUV to McDonald's every fucking day. Like, my $70,000 extended cab Chevy Silverado that I've never taken on a gravel road before. I just take to Costco and back home. I can't do that more forever. And it's like, no, no. For us to continue to live as a society, and if we want to solve the contradiction of imperial plunder and the imperial mode of living in the imperial core, and we want to just be happier, because ultimately this consumption doesn't lead to happiness, we have to decommodify our lives and shift our economy away from mindless consumption. And that means shifting away from a capitalist system built on the profit produced by superfluous production and the incessant, growing, manic consumption that it demands. And a life of actual more, in the sense of commodities, like a less commodified life means less shit, less trinkets and gadgets and plastic stuff. But it means more community. It means more connection to the earth and the people around you. It means a slower pace of life. And this manic quest that capitalism has entrapped us in for infinite continual growth, right? If the GDP, if the economy stops growing for 3 months, we call it a recession. After 6 months, it's a depression. That means this system cannot survive unless it is manically going forth and consuming and plundering and consuming and producing. Okay, that served a historical role, right? That sort of production and consumption served a role to create an economic machine that is global and that has reached unprecedented levels of wealth. But it is unsustainable. And the whole thing of socialism is taking that insane machine, taking the best qualities of it, the medical and technological aspects that it's developed, changing the social relations away from profit and exploitation towards communal flourishing, and moving humanity into a new phase of out of their adolescence into a mature adulthood that is constrained, that is community based, that is embedded in real community, and that isn't dependent on endless superfluous consumption and infinite growth for its own sake. That's a much harder pitch. So the first pitch, everything you want, healthcare, better wages, your tax dollars to be funneled back into community investment and infrastructure and uplifting regular Americans and solving poverty and solving homelessness, all those things that most people do want. The only way you're going to get that is you stop the imperial death machine that takes trillions of our dollars and goes around the world and tries to slaughter people for corporations. Okay? That's step one, and most people can nod their head in approval. And I think if a political party emerged in the US that had true working class economics and true anti-war politics, we would call it anti-imperialist, but for messaging more broadly, anti-war, we're against the deep state, we're against the CIA, we're against the Pentagon. We do not need to have our military bases all around the world. Huge majorities of people would support that political party. If it was sincere, it wasn't just an attempt for the Democrats to rebrand or the fake populist on the right to pretend they're in support of, but was real, was rooted in like labor unions and shit, people would flock to that party. But it's that second level that's a little harder. But guess what? That second level of giving up your consumption life, that's coming to an end anyway. It's going to come to an end through managed, mature understanding and shifting away, which is not the American way. Or it's going to come to an end through smashing into a fucking brick wall, creating climate and biosphere catastrophes, plastic pollution. Right now, you and I are sitting with microplastics flowing through our fucking blood, like lead flew through the blood of our parents. And that whole way of life, it has to come to an end. So that consumption-based lifestyle is coming to an end one way or another. That's the hardest thing to get through to a regular American. We should do the proactive managed thing. We're not going to do that. We're going to do the slam into a brick wall thing, unfortunately. But what happens? Is it going to be a soft landing? Is it going to, he says civil war. I think in order for there to be a civil war, Americans have to get a lot less comfortable. So, the guy that's a patriot that has AR-15s at home that drives his big ass fucking truck to work with the Punisher logo on the back of his truck, that guy's not fighting and dying in the streets for an idea. That guy's going home to his air-conditioned fucking McMansion and watching Fox News, and overeating before he passes out and farts into his bed all night. That's what that guy's doing. So to get Americans out on the street to fight and die, the level of comfort and stability has to completely erode. That's collapse. So a civil war will only come out of collapse, which is to my point earlier. A revolution can come out of collapse, and balkanization can come out of collapse. So more than even a civil war, I think the possibility of a balkanized U.S. under all these contradictions exploding mid-century could result in, maybe like a standoff between states, secessionist movements or blocks of states that are against the executive, going their own way, creating constitutional crises in the process. This happened once in American history. It was the American Civil War. And more than ending slavery, what Abraham Lincoln wanted to do was preserve the Union, right? So there's some historical precedent of the threat of balkanization and civil war trying to address a core contradiction in the United States, which was there since its founding, which was slavery at that time. And so there are some of these historical precedents that we can look to and kind of think about. But yeah, and then the other thing I really love that he said there is that crises are learning processes. That throughout this long 21st century, and my God, it's just getting started, we are going to go through crises, economic, environmental in particular, and many more, and technological, that are going to bring about immense suffering in the short and medium term, but that through the process are going to reorient people's views of all of these things. One example is climate change. Climate change is not being addressed. It's going to be bad. If I had to put my money on a final degree of change that we're looking for, I bet we're going to be in that 2.5 to 3 degree rise in temperature by mid to late century, which is catastrophic. For huge parts of the world is catastrophic. You can go through all of the implications of that for different areas in the world, but it is going to be catastrophic. It's going to create mass migration. But what that also does, and this has happened throughout human history, is that it's going to force our entire species, centering our politics around this new perpetual crisis, to continue to develop technologies and pour resources in, as well as intellectual resources, into understanding the climate system such that in 100, 200, 300 years, humanity will evolve to a species that has pretty much total control over its climate, right? That through the crisis of climate change, which humanity is not proactive in stopping, will live and suffer through, and then will come out the other side by necessity, pouring resources, technology, manpower, intellectual power into this problem, will come out the other side a species that is now, at least on that front, more mature in its relationship to the natural world. And like we have a thermostat in our house, we will build the infrastructure to have a thermostat for the planet. That's 2300, 2200, who knows? But that's the process we're going through. Now, think about that on the social, economic, and political levels as well. That this crisis of the 21st century is a crossroads for humanity. It could result in our collapse as a civilization. I think that's on the tail end of probability. It could result in AI and the techno-utopians being right, and all of a sudden we usher in this new era of productivity and AIs take over and manage all of our problems. That's on a very tail end of probabilities as well. What's going to happen is we're going to land somewhere in the middle of the bell curve, right? A mixture of advancements and horrific regressions and crises and localized collapses reverberating throughout the global economy, and then socialist experiments, let's say in the global south, trying to find new ways to live, re-entrenchment and refusal to change from the global north, but the contradictions bearing down so much that change has to happen. We'll see fascist movements and climate authoritarians arise. We'll see, new forms of green parties win, socialist parties win, even in places we don't expect. And we're going to fumble through the motherfucking century. Humans are not going to go extinct if I had to bet money on it, but we're going to have perhaps the worst global crisis that we've ever lived through in human history, precisely because of its global nature. That these are not localized. This is not the fall of Rome, right? This is a global, biospheric, climatological driven series of crises that never end and get worse and worse and worse until we start solving it. And so, it's not a pretty picture, but still, and I always want to bring it back to this because we're not taking the black pill here. Out of the ruins and even in the crisis comes incredible opportunities that we cannot foresee. And our level of organization and education will largely dictate the trajectory of these various societies. Whatever society you're in right now, the more organized your revolutionary wing is, your left wing of your society, the more political power it accrues, the better positioned it is to push that society in the midst of chaos or in the ruins of it in a positive direction. And in lieu of that, you will get barbarism, you will get corporate re-entrenchment, you will get fascism. That's the lessons of history. So this does not take any responsibility off our plate, but it does necessitate that we become a lot more resilient, a lot stronger mentally, emotionally, physically, politically, and that we really don't have a chance or a choice. We do have a chance, we don't have a choice, right? The world is forcing us to respond meaningfully. And that's our great responsibility. So yeah, Torkel Olafsson, in my analysis, I think dovetail quite well.
Yeah, I think so as well. So we'll get you to react to another clip here. This is, a previous episode we did with Vijay Prashad. And here I'd asked him, in light of, sort of, let's say the zenith of socialist struggle being in the 20th century, and then you obviously had the history of the collapse of the Soviet Union. a historic setback for the left, that kind of thing. I asked him, where is the socialist horizon today? And, how do we orient ourselves toward that? Um, and just to give you a little context before I hit play, he started out by talking about how the space for contesting politics, more broadly, has really shrunk, and how much the center has shifted toward the right in the neoliberal era. So he's talking about the importance of opening up space as an immediate task. Yeah, okay. So having set that up, we'll play it from here.
If you're on the street and somebody just excessively with a belligerent personality wants to, rumble with you, other people will intervene and say, hey, take it easy, guy. That's how the world works. There's a lot of people who want to say, take it easy. It's called the United Nations. Yeah, we got to strengthen the United Nations. All of this is moving towards building near a socialist agenda. Right now, the socialist agenda is really a social democratic agenda until we push the gates further and see the class struggle intensifying. Right now, most of the things socialists are talking about, eradicating poverty, peace, development, these are basically things that if there were social democrats in the world, they would be fighting for. They don't exist. Yeah, they've become neoliberals. So we are forced to do their historical mission. There's no space for us to say, let's intensify the class struggle. Yeah. Then you'll be sectarian out here saying, I'm not interested in solving the poverty question. I'm intensifying the class struggle. Okay, you may be right. That's what Marxists are supposed to do. But right now, our historical mission is basically being shifted because the social democrats and liberals have vanished. You see a person hungry on the street, you can't just say, hey, listen, there's a liberal behind me. He's going to feed you. I'm building the class struggle. I can't solve you can't do that. You're a human being. You got to say, how do we feed these people? How do we fight for, soup kitchens and so on? That's the problem with socialist politics today. So when you say, oh, Zoran Mamdani, he's a limited social democrat, but so are you. What's your agenda that's so radical? How are you able to intensify the class struggle by yourself? The tempo right now is not moving in that direction. So don't lecture Zoran Mamdani or myself and say, you guys are just like liberals. Well, yes, because they have absented themselves. So we have to fight against hunger and we have to fight against illiteracy and so on. Yeah, we have to fight in this terrain until sufficient numbers of liberals are back on the field, social democrats. Then we can go and say, I'm against the politics of social democracy. I want something more radical than that. Unless the people are on the streets, strikes and so on, you can't just stand there and say, hey, go on strike. Right now, the class struggle is defined by the bourgeoisie. The owners of property are the ones who are driving the class struggle. The workers are not. That's the stage of history we're in. So I can't stand on the sidewalk like some mad person saying, I've been communicating with aliens. Workers go on strike. The workers will look at me and go, man, I'm an Uber Eats guy. I got to go deliver the food. Can you just make room for my bicycle?
Yeah, I think it's a hard pill for some people on the radical left to swallow, but it is ultimately true. What's happening is with the decay of capitalism, imperialism, comes the decay of liberalism. And where liberals and social democrats once formed a bloc, once could be reasonably seen as a progressive force in history, that period is over. And they've abdicated the field. And so then the far left is there. And we sometimes get too subcultural, meaning we are so far into theory and abstractions that we are alienated from regular working people. And when some of us try to go and appeal to regular working people, even fighting on the electoral terrain, it's far too easy to just dismiss them as liberals, mere social democrats, blah, blah, blah. But then VJ has a good dialectical response. What are you doing? And I have many reasons to be skeptical of Mamdani, right? But if he actually does open up, state subsidized grocery stores, he actually does, make rent easier to pay for workers. He actually does take on the establishment of the New York City elite milieu. He will be advancing the ball. Bernie Sanders, we all have critiques of him. He advanced the ball for class consciousness in the United States. There is no question that there are countless people on the Marxist, anarchist, left comm, whatever left today because they went through the Bernie Sanders moment. But what we need to do as much understanding as and what I'm talking about here in the Imperial Core, we do have to think about what are people's real problems. How do we organize to solve their real problems? And not just in mutual aid, going out to a park and handing out food. That's beautiful. I've done that. That's great. But conquering political power and putting our policies in front of the entire society, in front of the masses, and moving in that direction. You know, if Bernie Sanders would have won, he would not be a revolutionary Marxist, but he would advance the ball for working class organization. He would have shifted the Overton window, and in some ways he still did, to the left. He would have brought to the fore core problems and reframed them for a population that has been, lobotomized by right-wing corporate ideology for decades. And that would have cleared so much space for more radical organizing and action to take place. So I do think that there is a balance to strike here between not being naive and supporting anybody that comes along dressed as a lefty, right? We can see problems with people, like AOC, who takes the socialist mantle. And that's what's dangerous. It's not like I'm a progressive or no, I'm a democratic socialist. Takes that mantle, brands herself with that label, and then waters it down through, being cozy with Nancy Pelosi, refusing to take on the Democratic Party, supporting Zionism, and just being pushed around. Right? Like when AOC came in, Nancy Pelosi and the fucking snake-eyed elites in the Democratic Party are like, we can kowtow her, right? We can scare her, we can spook her, we can tell her that she's going to lose her career if she doesn't do this or that. We can shut her out from the upper echelons of the Democratic Party and make her a fringe figure, if we want to. And we can bend her to our will, and if we can't, we can isolate her. And the Zionist lobby kind of did the same thing. They sent people to give her pity parties about like, hey, innocent people, like, we don't agree with what's going on with Netanyahu either, but the Iron Dome, it just protects regular people who are just going about their lives, and she doesn't have any political spine, blah, blah, blah. We all know the story. So we have to still have the ground to critique that, while at the same time not being so dogmatic that anything short of, insane revolutionary action tomorrow is some sort of a betrayal or a failure. And there's a way in which people who just get their politics from online, who spend all day typing to each other and being in these echo chambers and these Discord servers and on Twitter 8 hours a day, who become just kind of warped in their analysis of reality in such a way that they cannot relate to or communicate with regular people politically. They cannot talk about issues that regular people care about. And if we're ever going to win, we have to be able to do that. We have to marry high knowledge, high theoretical knowledge with on-the-ground material, practical work that advances the ball for our class. And that will require, undoubtedly in the United States, over the foreseeable future, struggling on the electoral terrain. That does not mean become a part of the Democratic Party. No. Our struggles in the electoral terrain have to be in direct and loud, principled opposition to the Republican and the Democratic Party in totality. And that's where Sanders failed. Bernie had the chance after 2016 and even after 2020 to some extent to do what Corbyn is finally doing now in the UK, which is I'm breaking completely from this defunct party. It is completely taken over by the corporations, by the military-industrial complex, by Zionists. I need to use my political capital with the people. Bernie Sanders still to this day ranks as the most favored politician in the United States by Americans. That's incredible. Take that social capital and shift it in to a principled democratic socialist political party that can bring up young politicians, that can run under our own banner, that can have our own forms of organization outside and in opposition to the Democratic Party. And I truly think that is our task. Because, we can't just be seen as radical militant extremists that like march through the streets sometimes, and like cheer on Luigi when he takes out a CEO. If we're just that, then we're just marginalized. And for the average person living their life, they do not see how our politics, as they see it, connects at all with their daily requirements and needs. Like, I need to fucking feed my kids, and I need to figure out daycare, and I need, a raise, and how am I going to fucking retire? And healthcare costs are insane. How do we address those problems? Not by, chanting Marx or Mao quotes at them, not just by rioting in the streets, although there's plenty of room for that at times, but it is by creating the organization and the capacity necessary to intervene on the political level and actually show our ideology, our policies, and be able to pursue those policies and put them in practice. Once people start seeing that it's the crazy socialists that are actually solving my problems, all the ideology, the anti-communist and anti-socialist ideology dissolves of its own accord because the material comes first. If we solve material problems, the ideological superstructure of anti-communism collapses around it. And so instead of trying to fight on the level of superstructure, actually communism is right, and this is what Stalin and Trotsky and this is blah blah blah. Okay, there's a place for that. But instead of fighting in the superstructural realm solely, we have to fight primarily on the material realm. And that will require getting our hands dirty in the electoral front. And that will require compromises in some sense, on some levels, not on our core values. But that will require maneuvering and strategy and organization. And sometimes just screaming out your politics is a vacuous stand-in for real politics, which requires talking to people who don't agree with you, struggling, sacrificing your own personal careerism to contribute to something bigger, and the messy reality of trying to create real change in the world as opposed to sitting in a vacuum of purity and just bestowing upon the world your perfect ideas, right? That's idealism. So I think VJ is definitely onto something. The liberals, in order to maintain the liberal order, they have to go to the right. If fascism is capitalism in decay and liberalism is the political ideology of capital, we know historically and certainly presently and going forward that liberalism is not going to move to the left. Liberalism, to entrench its underlying material reality, will have to move to the right. And so that creates a huge vacuum on the center left all the way to the far left where it's really been abandoned. And it's our job, I think, to take that over and like BJ said, solve people's real material problems. And you can do that in organization at the community level right now, while we build towards the higher forms of organization that allow us to do that on larger scales.
Thanks for that, Brett. As we approach, the end of our conversation here, I wanted to ask you about, the question of fear. People today, even those who are politically on our side, but who are not organized, are scared to turn their, maybe personal politics into action. And for those that are already, acting on their politics, certainly fear stops a lot of people from going further, from escalating further. This is a very real concern. Civil liberties in the global north have really plunged since, especially October 2023. Whether we're talking about the fact that you can literally be, kidnapped in the US by ICE at any given time, greater clampdowns at universities in North America, the designation of a non-violent group, Palestine Action, as a terrorist entity in the UK. And then, of course, we've seen these brutal videos of the German police violently terrorizing Palestine solidarity protesters, etc. The examples go on. So I wanted to ask you, as someone who's had their head bashed in by the police before, you've been paid visits by to your home by some special people, let's call them. How should the left be contending with the question of fear at this particular moment, particularly when, the world and our societies demands more of us, and particularly in the global north?
Yeah, it's a big question. There's two sides to it initially. The first side is, and I always remind people of this, is that crackdown is a sign of the status quo's weakening. That they're no longer able to use ideology to buffer opinions and lock people out. They have to resort to raw, violent suppression, which every time they do, they overextend themselves. They create new people that are like, what the fuck is this system? Like, we come out and we just protest, we get attacked. Oh, you can go mass murder hundreds of thousands of innocent Palestinians, but if somebody tries to, spray some chemical into the weapons that you're using to kill those people, that's a crime. People that are fighting back in Palestine or protesting on college campuses here in the U.S. for human rights are the terrorists, but Netanyahu, who is the Hitler of our time, can come and get standing ovations in front of Congress. So as their system weakens, they lash out more violently, and every time they lash out more violently, they reveal more of themselves to more people. This is the dialectic. So there's that aspect. On the other hand, okay, that's all nice and fine, but in the short term, like we're at threat. That's true. What buffets and buffers your safety is community and mass movements. So like when Mahmoud Khalil got arrested by ICE and detained, right? If there weren't mass protests, if there weren't journalists writing about it every day, if there weren't political educators talking about it, if there weren't progressive lawyers willing to fight back, if there weren't this entire array of people coming over and over and over again to the streets and to his trials and having his back and making noise about it, not letting people forget about it, they could have easily just disappeared him quietly, right? And they've done this throughout history many times during the Ferguson riots and stuff. A lot of those people, those black organizers that got disappeared or mysteriously killed, they didn't have, for whatever reason, the mass movements behind them that could keep concerted pressure on the forces of the state that were imposing that suffering and keep those stories going and cycling. Things get memory hold and moved on. So how do you stay safe? You build community and organization. But community itself, when you're going and you're organizing in your community, you're building community with other people who have your back, right? Here in Omaha, we have many organizations in a mid-sized, Midwestern, moderate to conservative city and in a deep red state. And we had ICE raids, and I have a good friend of mine who actually just driving to work and saw an ICE raid taking place against a family, and jumped out of his car and went and stood in front of this ICE truck trying to take somebody away, trying to disappear somebody. And he was charged with all these federal crimes, right? Like federal felonies of assaulting a federal officer, whatever this shit. They throw charges at you. If you've ever been arrested at a protest, they just vomit out charges on you, and very few of them stick. But it scares you, it intimidates you, and a big reason they do it not only is to lock you up in legal nonsense and molasses, but is also to intimidate you from doing it again. But what happened in that case is that because there's community here, people made noise, people showed up, people were taking care of his kids and his pets at his house, making sure that they collected money to pay his rent so he wasn't evicted when he got out, showing up at his hearings, trying to find lawyers who will fight for him pro bono. And that eventually got the charges way reduced, got him out, and now he has a real fight. In lieu of that, he could have just been, just completely at the mercy of the brutal state and its legal system. So community, getting out in the world, getting out from behind your computer screen, taking on some level of risk, but being smart about it, right? You're not an individual hero. You don't need to be the next Luigi. Look what happened to Luigi. I mean, we should still have his back, and that's exactly what I'm talking about. Make noise, continue to stoke support around him, because it's a core issue in our society, and he is like an avatar for that. And in some sense, he's like being punished for something that we all agree with, like that this entire system is disgusting, and the person he killed was profiting off of people's suffering and misery, our own family's suffering and misery. So we show out for him, but he went outside of community, outside of organization, did a deed, and now he himself is paying the consequences for it for a very long time. So you got to be very strategic with the sort of risks you take and the background conditions in which that risk is conducted. When I did get, at early anti-fascist rallies in 2017, we would show up and confront these organized groups of genuine fascists, and the cops would crack down on us, of course. And that's when I got like pepper sprayed, tackled. My head was, grazed like into the concrete as I was saying I'm not resisting, like how they do. But it was the community that bailed me out. That when I came out, they had food and almost chokes me up a little bit talking about it, but drinks and food and comfort, they stayed with me every step of the way. They came to my hearing. They supported me. And that was not only psychologically important for me to go through that process, but it showed the system, hey, he's not by himself. You know, every step of the way, you're trying to make an example out of him or something. They could still do it, but there's going to be resistance. There's going to be protests. There's going to be people who are writing him, that give a fuck about him, that are going to show up for him. And that in and of itself can be a deterrent for some of the more grotesque directions that the state can take suppression in. So again, the answer is not romantic. It's not easy. It's organizing in community over and over and over again. That is our only hope. And so fear is warranted. Fear is healthy. Fear is an evolutionarily programmed emotion that allowed us to survive for all these, hundreds of thousands of years as the human species. So there's a role that it plays, but when it controls you, when it prevents you from taking a stand, from speaking out, from organizing, then it becomes a tool of the ruling class that has worked on you. You know, they have successfully mobilized fear to shut you down. And so you have to balance strategy and repercussions with I'm going to do what I can in this historical moment to live up. Because if everybody just shuts up because of fear, nothing ever happens again. Then we're just totally dominated. It's the people that in the face of fear still stand up and do something that push the ball forward and make it safer for other people behind them to come up and say some stuff or to do some stuff. So that's the kind of cause and effect, domino effect of fear and the balance that has to be struck. And ultimately, I want to emphasize the protection that is offered by community and organization, and how doing stuff in big groups, with people that love you and have your back, which is different, one last point, than like January 6th. Whereas a bunch of individuals coming together, they didn't have mass movements. They didn't have community connections, right? They flew in from all over the world because they're just having their brain fried from Fox News. And there were a bunch of individuals, and the government just picked them off one by one, sent their asses to jail. There were some little protest, a January 6th people. There's no community rootedness. There was no organization that really had their backs. And so they were made an example of. Not to say that that can't happen still with organization and community, but it's less likely to happen, and you have more leverage than you otherwise would have. So that's those are some thoughts, but again, not an easy time, and there's no easy answers here.
Lastly, Brett, what is your case for hope and optimism? I think this is an important question at this juncture. We talked about the timeline ahead, even with Torkel Lausen, he was talking about, 2050 is really a turning point. You were talking about, mid-century to late century. I mean, we're all going to be, you and I are going to be alive, hopefully, during, that time. I think, the case for hope and optimism is important. So, what keeps you going? Why should others, be political optimists?
Sure. And I will just make one quick point too. Mid-century, things are completely going to have to change, but every year leading up to that is still going to bring its own crisis, its own intensity. The 2030s are going to be fucking insane. The 2040s are going to be fucking insane. So it's not like we can just sit back and like have this system creak by for another 30 years. No way. But yeah, by mid-century, things are going to be forced upon us. That's when climate crisis really kicks in. Economic systems totally unsustainable by that point, etc. So just the point about the timeline. But yeah, so optimism is important. Gramsci, pessimism of the intellect, optimism of the will. We are in a long line of human beings who fought against a wide variety of incomprehensible challenges and came out the other side. Every single one of all of our ancestors listening right now survived and reproduced, right? Every single one going back 100, 200,000 years. That's a long line of people who refused to be squashed and snuffed out. We owe it to ourselves, to our neighbors, to our loved ones, and to the future of humanity to do everything we can. And ultimately, what gives me optimism, and this comes from Buddhism as well as dialectical materialism and Marxism, change is the only constant. We are not going to be stomped by a boot forever. We are not going to have to live in this rotten system forever. Getting out of this system is going to be crazy and chaotic and scary. But our ancestors did it before. the end of slavery, the fall of the Roman Empire, the end of feudalism, the French Revolution, the Haitian Revolution, go all through the global South, all their national liberation struggles. People over and over and over and over again through history have been placed in historical moments they did not choose, and they rose to the challenge in various ways, despite the fear, despite the repression, despite the consequences, and oftentimes even the self-sacrifice. But the fact that things always change and that we are living in a period of change, it doesn't have to be scary. It can be exhilarating. That we are living through a crucial moment that will determine the next several hundred years of human life. And that is in some sense overwhelming, but what's the alternative? That we just keep working our shitty jobs and keep buying stuff until we die, and then the system just goes on forever? We don't want that either. So I would rather have the, I mean, necessary, exhilarating, also scary and challenging upheaval of a rotten, dying system and the possibility of creating something new than just the status quo forever. And part of being human at the psychological level and the political level is accepting change. That change is the only constant. It's a cascade of constant change, dialectics, evolution. It's always happening. It's never resting. And I do believe in the human spirit. I look back over the entirety of human history, and we're still here. We're still here, and we've been on the goddamn moon, and we have space shuttles, and we're smashing particles together to try to figure out the secrets of the cosmos, and we're still fighting for human dignity and decency and liberation. So there's no reason to think that this is the end. This is just another turning of a chapter. And yeah, so strap in and get with community, organize, make yourself more robust intellectually and spiritually and emotionally through certain spiritual practices and community that I've laid out here and other places. And rise to the challenge of the moment. This is life. This is life. It's never going to be just a nice, comfortable, sitting in a recliner, eating your favorite snack forever. Life is challenge and growth and fight. And all of nature is in constant churn. So accept that at the deepest levels you can possibly accept something. And that clears a lot of the way for you to be able to act meaningfully in that context and to think constantly about, I am trying to contribute what I can to the future of the human species. And everybody that comes after me will live in a world that is at least partially influenced by the choices I make. And that is a huge responsibility, but it's also a liberating opportunity.
Yeah, totally. And, I'll also, in terms of the case for optimism, I'll echo what Vijay Prashad had said on that previous episode we had. The whole world is not the North Atlantic. And I think there's, a lot of reason to be optimistic looking at the global South. I mean, one example I'll give is you'll find this interesting, Brett. I mean, when I was just coming to learn about Marxism and moving further toward I guess the revolutionary left. I mean, the first episode I heard of Rev Left was actually the one with the one on Thomas Sankara. And that was like what? That was like 4-ish years ago. I mean, 2021. Little did I know that, like I would, we would see sort of the reincarnation of that revolution as embodied in, Ibrahim Traore. Today, like, I mean, after, 2 or 3 years, I mean, it also, that also, I mean, in line with the rest of the conversation we're having, I mean, that shows sort of the pace of history too, it's fits and starts. And, the Lenin quote about, God, I'm gonna butcher it, but, the decades,
There are decades when nothing happens, or there are decades when nothing happens and weeks when decades happen, something like
there you
that.
go. Yeah, yeah. Or yeah, there you go. So yeah, and I mean a lot of things coming out of China as well. I mean, we've been talking about the ecological collapse. I mean, if the world was serious about it, it would get serious about trading trading with China. They're you know quite advanced in terms of their green technology. They've already worked out a lot of these problems. I mean, we can work through that together. Obviously, the imperialists, they don't want to by definition.
Mhm.
Anyway, I think that's a good note to leave it on, Brett. I really appreciate your time here. You've been generous with it. Um, I mean, I'm sure the listeners are familiar with you and your work, but can you just let the listeners know where they can find you?
Yeah, well, first of all, if you're listening on my feed, go subscribe to International Solidarity Podcast. I'll link to those in the show notes, because I think you're doing really, really good work. And looking at some of your other interviews, very principled, very informative, and I really appreciate your voice in this space. So keep up the amazing work. As for me, you can find what I do at revleftradio.com. There you can find Red Menace, which I do with my co-host Allison Escalante. We cover texts as well as current events, and then Rev Left Radio, which you can find all the stuff needed on that one website. And so, yeah, I really appreciate you taking the time to have me on your show, and I'm honored to be a part of your esteemed list of guests that you've had on. And I hope that your listeners get something out of this conversation. And I'm really really appreciative of you having me on. So thank you so much.